Why communism is even worse than fascism. I'm aware that if you follow our channel, you understand nuance and complexity, but sadly not everyone does. In view of this, I have to make this disclaimer for those who will inevitably attempt to misrepresent what I'm saying in the future. Nothing I'm about to say is intended to serve as a defense of fascism. Arguing about whether fascism is better than communism is like fighting over your preferred flavor of gangrene. I merely ask that those of you who abhor fascism as much as I do are also willing to be intellectually honest and recognize the fact that communism is in fact even worse. I met a Bulgarian man in an Amsterdam cafe earlier this week. He recognized me and we talked about many things. He asked me if I'd seen Chernobyl, the HBO miniseries, and I said no, because I hate watching stuff everyone's banging on about. He said, "I know what you mean, but you must watch it because it perfectly captures the society we lived in, where fear and cowardice triumphs over truth." I watched Chernobyl the day I got home, and he's right. The series is so authentic, it immediately hits you in the gut when you recognize it. But he also told me a fascinating story about his country that I was not aware of. The man who eventually became the first president of Bulgaria when the USSR collapsed, Zhelev, was a dissident during Soviet times who was expelled from the Communist Party and made unemployable for years. Eventually, in 1982, he wrote a book called Fascism, in which he chronicled the fascist regimes in Spain, Italy, and Germany before, during, and after World War II. Was this a ploy to curry favor with the Communist Party by criticizing its enemies? Not exactly. The book was banned within weeks of publication because the similarities between the societies he described in the book and the one he lived in were far too striking to ignore. The parallels between these two collectivist ideologies are of course exceedingly obvious. Spawned during the same time period as a response to the same problem and offering many of the same solutions, communists and fascists had stark differences, but on economics in particular, Hitler's National Socialists were not as different to other kinds of socialists as people would like to believe. The reasons for this historical revisionism differ from country to country. In Russia, where I come from, a law passed in 2014 criminalized any meaningful comparison between the crimes of the Soviet Union and the exact same crimes committed by Nazi Germany. As a result, most people in Russia, and frankly elsewhere, have no idea that when Hitler started World War II by invading Poland, he wasn't alone. The Soviet Union invaded Poland at exactly the same time, capturing more territory than the Germans. This was the product of an explicit, albeit secret, agreement between Hitler and Stalin in which they divided Eastern Europe as they saw fit, something called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Ironically, in Russia, which experienced communism firsthand, the comparison between communism and fascism is not banned in order to defend the ideology of communism, merely to protect the historical view of Russians as a good people who sacrificed millions of lives to stop Hitler, which is of course true. In the West, on the other hand, communism apologists operate from a rather different set of needs. First, despite what historian Roger Morehouse calls the devil's alliance between Nazi Germany and the USSR, Hitler soon stabbed his new friend in the back, and by June 1941, having been invaded, the Soviets found themselves on the same side as Britain and France, fighting Germany. Orwell's magnificent preface to Animal Farm makes clear the corrosive effect this necessary alliance had on the West's ability to criticize communism. You may be familiar with the following Orwell quote: "I'm well acquainted with all the arguments against freedom of thought and speech, the arguments which claim that it cannot exist, and the arguments which claim that it ought not to. I answer simply that they don't convince me, and that our civilization over a period of 400 years has been founded on the opposite notice." What you likely aren't familiar with is the sentence that followed it, which was, "For quite a decade past, I have believed that the existing Russian regime is a mainly evil thing, and I claim the right to say so, in spite of the fact that we are allies with the USSR in a war which I want to see won." The argument for preventing this sort of sentiment from being aired was simple. We needed the Soviet Union to win the war, and shutting up Stalin's critics was a price worth paying. In other words, some whitewashing of communist crimes is a product of practical considerations, but not all. There were, and I can tell you from direct personal experience, still are many people in Western societies who are temperamentally inclined towards the allure of radical socialism. As they see the negative trade-offs of capitalism, their instincts for compassion, empathy, and care kick into overdrive. Combined with an idealism which blinds them to the sad truth of life that any society will always have unsolvable problems, they see only the flaws in their own and assume that the opposite must be better. George Bernard Shaw, for example, loved communism and worshipped Stalin. Walter Duranty of the New York Times won a Pulitzer Prize for his fraudulent coverage of the Holodomor and widespread famine in the Soviet Union, in which millions starved to death, including members of my own family. I won't waste your time with more examples. We all know some on the left cover for communism because they believe in it, or want to believe it hasn't been tried properly. Nor will I give you the standard anti-communist talking points about the death toll from communist regimes, which far exceeds those of any other ideology. I won't remind you that Che Guevara, whose face is an ever-present symbol of resistance around the world, was in fact nothing more than a racist, homophobic mass murderer. Above and beyond these very real atrocities, the true horror of the communist system was something that went beyond its material impact. As my newly made Bulgarian friend told me, Bulgaria has a difficult history, he said, constantly invaded, occupied by the Ottomans for centuries, and we always bounced back, but we still haven't recovered from communism. Why? Because while fascism is nationalistic, totalitarian, and collectivist, it does not aspire to dominate the lives of ordinary citizens to anything like the same extent. Communism, remember, rejected the idea of private property, private enterprise, or indeed a private life of any kind. In the Soviet Union, you were explicitly told to put the interests of the state above not only your own, but those of your loved ones. If you read my book, An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West, you'll remember the story of Pavlik Morozov, a boy who reported his own father to the authorities and was held up as a national hero. Fascism was almost as evil as communism, to be sure, but it did not attempt to achieve its aims by stealing and redistributing private property, seizing your business, or installing a new tyrannical hierarchy under the pretense of eradicating it. The fear and deceit you see depicted so accurately in the Chernobyl miniseries is a product of a society that has fundamentally broken the will of its own people. The drive to better your own life, to see your children prosper and thrive, to create and build things worthy of notice and admiration. All of these were beaten, starved, and tortured out of the people who had the misfortune to live under communist regimes. So yes, communist societies did kill, starve, rape, and torture more people than the fascists. But they also engaged in the totalitarianism of the mind, of the kind that not even Hitler aspired to. It is for this reason, above all others, that those of us who lived under communism, or come from families that did, reject so strongly the modern trend in which ideology is elevated above truth, political correctness is prioritized over facts, and the powers that be increasingly seek to control not only what we do, but also what we think.